property ownership has never been higher. In the last couple of years, while people enjoyed the inflation of 7, 8%, 5%, and they saw their property prices go up, so did the associating cost. Insurance almost doubled. Property management fees are now 6, 8, sometimes even 10%. Leasing fees can be as high as 4 or 6 weeks of your rent per year. Plus, on top of that, you've got to consider raising rate of council, water, land tax, body corporate, and it just goes on and on and on. And what that means is that you may be in more and more of a negative territory when you're investing in property. Now, I'm going to share with you this video, what is the true cost of property ownership, how you can mitigate some of your outgoings, which is all of the ongoing costs for your property, and what I do to make sure that I'm always ahead of the game in terms of managing my expenses when it comes to property ownership and how I grow from that. My name is Helen Tarrant, and I help everyday Australians become wealthy through investing in commercial by building them a cash flow rich portfolio and surrounding you with a team of experts that can help you grow and increase your wealth in the fastest possible time. If you're interested in halving your investment journey and investing in commercial property, then you need to click the link below, book in for a free strategy session, or join one of our free upcoming events. Now let's get started. Now, there is typically 3 different types of expenses when it comes to owning a property, and most people don't talk about it. They just roll it into one and say, well, this is what's going to cost you to get into a property, this is how much negative you're going to be, or positive or neutral per week, and they boil it down to like $50 or $100 negative or positive a week, and that's it really. And then you hold it for a few years, refinance, and go again. They gave you just the high level smoke and mirrors version of investing in property. The true cost of investing in property, apart from the opportunity, the capital growth, and the cash flow, and your fastest way to retirement, is actually 3-fold. Number 1 is the purchasing cost. Purchasing cost is what it costs you to buy that property. Now, there is 3 major costs when it comes to purchasing your property that most people miss. Now, firstly is stamp duty. Stamp duty is the most expensive of the purchasing cost. It typically costs you anywhere between 4.5% to 5.5%, depending on which state you're going to purchase in, to buy that property. So typically you budget around that 5% mark. So if you're buying $1 million property, that's $50,000 that you need to have on the side. The bank is not going to lend you that $50,000. You're going to need to put into the property or give to the government really when you purchase the property. Apart from stamp duty, you're going to need legal accounting costs. Right? So you're going to need your legal and accounting costs because you're going to need someone to do your conveyancing, someone to look over your contracts, someone to give you advice about or defects or anything else to do with the properties that is part of the contract. So you need a good solicitor, and that typically can cost $2,000 to $3,000 in a transaction. You're going to need accounting fees because no matter how you purchase it, and if you're doing commercial property, you definitely need to set up an entity. That entity itself may cost $2,000 or $3,000, or if you buy it in a self-managed super fund, it may cost $4,000 to $5,000 to set up, and you need to have that set up before you actually sign the contract to avoid the double stamp duty, because let's face it, who has an extra $50,000 lying around, right? So those are your 3 purchasing costs that you need to factor in, and typically those will add up to roughly around 7% of your purchase price. So give or take, right? So that's about $70,000 on $1 million purchase. So make sure you do have that set aside in cash or have access to that so that you can settle the property, because let's face it, the government's not going to settle the property unless you have that money handy, right? So that's to get into the property, right? This is on top of the deposit you need to have. Obviously, when you purchase a property, you need to have deposits. Anyway, if you're a residential, something like 10% to up to 35% in commercial. So commercial, you can borrow up to 80%, or sometimes if you're high net worth, they might even do lend you 100%. But most of the time, most people do 65 to 80% in their loans in the commercial property space. So you need to have roughly around that minimum $200,000 to $300,000 if you want to buy a commercial property that's $1 million, right? So apart from the deposit, we know we need to allow 7% for the purchasing cost. Now, once you bought the property, right, this is where things get interesting. A lot of people miscalculate this at the beginning. So they go, they look at the outgoings and go, yeah, the outgoings are fine. Not really conscious what that means to them after they purchase the property. Because after you purchase the property, that outgoing becomes your outgoings, and you really need to be aware of them so you know you can afford to pay your outgoings. And this is where so many people leverage up to their residential property and they don't think they're negative, and then they have little expenses here, little expenses, little big expenses there, And then voila, they realize they can't sustain 5 properties because there's so many outgoings. And that's one of the key things we love about commercial property is that the tenant pays all the outgoings. So you're actually saving 30%. So on every $1,000, you're saving $300 back in your pockets because the tenant's paying for that outgoing. So what are the holding costs? So this is the cost that you're going to need to maintain the property. So I call it holding costs, you can call it maintenance costs, whatever you want to call it. So it's going to be land tax, it's going to be insurance, management fees, strata, body corporate, council or water rates. So there's about 5 major costs there, right? So your land tax, your insurance, your management, your strata, your council, all of that in commercial, the tenant pays for it. And typically in residential, it adds up to about 30% of the cost of the property. So if you're getting $1,000 a week, it's about $300 that goes out for those outgoings. But you need to pay them. Otherwise, the sheriff's going to knock on your door and say, where's my money? And they're going to force you to sell the property. So you need to make sure you actually have that available so that you can actually pay for that, whether you have a tenant or not. Now, in commercial property, there's ways to mitigate that so that you're getting positive cash flow as well as having your outgoings paid for as well. So those are the costs that you need to budget for. So you need to know if you're getting $1,000 and that your tenant's not paying for outgoings or you've got a residential tenant, you know, put aside $300 a week to be able to afford all of those things. Now, another thing that most people miss, right? So those are the 2 major things that we got to think about. Your stamp duty, your legals and accounting to getting in. Your number 2 are holding costs, where all of the 5 major costs, these are mandatory. So what we call statutory, right? Land tax, insurance, management fees, strata, council rates. Now, management fees in residential are somewhere between 7 to 8% now, right? If you're on the cheap, you get it for 6%. But guess what? In commercial, that is cheaper. It's about 4 to 5%. So it actually comes in, a lot of things actually comes in much cheaper in commercial property than most people realize. That's why the smarter investors are actually switching from residential to commercial property investing, because they're getting much better cash flow returns and they're not missing out on the growth. Again, if you want to find out more about commercial property investing, click the link below, book in for that free strategy session, but also most importantly, join one of our upcoming events. We've got a massive boot camp coming up, and I really want you to be participating in that because it's going to take you from beginning to end, all the different strategies around commercial property and how you can profit from that and thrive in 2025. Now let's get back to this. Ongoing costs, right? Now, ongoing costs is what most people miss, right? This is the big thing that people miss, right? So for example, accounting costs, right? If you have an entity, you buy things in a company or a trust, your accountant's got to do a tax return, and they might need to do a BAS return, which is for GST, if you have a commercial property, right? So those things cost money. They can typically be somewhere on the cheaper end, about $1,500 a year, to somewhere maybe $3,000 to $4,000 a year, depending how many properties you have in your entity. So you need to make sure you actually have that available as well. On top of that, you got to think about if something does happen in terms of maintenance of your property. Now, in the residential space, something happens, it's always your fault. It's always the landlord, right? There is an issue with the grass or the lawn or the pool, you have to fix it, right? Capital works. Something happens with the drains, something happens with fittings, light bulbs and everything else. It's always your issue in the residential space. Now in commercial, this is where you save again, right? You save again because the tenant's done their own fit out most of the time. And that means they take care of the property as if it's their own. So they take care of all the stuff internally. Unless it's structural, they're not going to ask you to replace it. So they're going to, broken light fittings, they're going to do it. Like leaking faucets, taps, they're going to fix it, right? Unless the air conditioning unit breaks, the maintenance of it is theirs, right? Unless, if you have a chipped tile, you have a leaking toilet, they're going to fix it. They're not going to ask you to fix it. But if the downpipe is broken, it's up to you, right? So you need to allot a certain amount of money for maintenance, right? And so a lot of people miss that because they go, oh, well, we're really not doing any maintenance. Well, big things can happen in 2 or 3 years' time when it might cost you 5, 10, 20 grand to fix, right? So let's say you even in place one air conditioning unit in a residential home or a commercial home, that's anywhere from $2,500 to $5,000, right? That can wipe out most of your positive cash flow, right? So what do you do in that situation? You need to make sure you have that buffer. So every year, ongoing costs that most people miss, it can be up to about $5,000. And this is why when you actually have multiple properties, you start thinking, how did it end up costing? Where did my money go? I wasn't making positive cash flow. What happened? This is exactly what happened. The costs associated with purchasing your property has not been taken care of. So these are all the costs today that we've listed. So number 1, your purchasing costs, right? Number 2 is your holding costs. Number 3 is going to be your ongoing costs. Now, what I haven't covered individually to you, you need to consider as part of you getting into the property, as in buying into the property, and also the ongoing is the maintenance of your loan. So your finances. So remember, when you get into it, everybody's finances is individual. So I can't comment on what your finance is going to be, but you typically may or may not be charged a valuation fee. There's maybe an establishment fee. And of course, if you choose to use a buyer's agency fee, it's going to be somewhere around 1.5% to 2.5% typically on the market for you to pay for that. So these are upfront costs. So your upfront cost could be as much as 10% on that purchasing cost rather than 7 or 5%. So you've got to make sure that for $1 million purchase, you're probably going to need your 20% deposits or 30% deposit plus an extra 7 to 10%, right? Which can be quite a lot of money. So buying property is not just a short-term game, it's a long-term game, long-term views, but you've got to have the right strategy in place. And this is what we help our clients with. We surround you with the right strategy to help you get to financial freedom faster through commercial property. In fact, typically our investors half the time of their investment journey through investing in commercial property rather than residential. So if you want to get a $50,000 or $100,000 in passive income, we have a blueprint. We have a detailed due diligence checklist to make sure that you find the right property to actually get you to your financial freedom figure in the shortest possible time, which is 3, 5, and 7 years. Now, click the link below, join one of our events, remember, or book in for that free strategy call. But remember, let's coming back to this final tip that I'm going to give you, that how do I minimize all of those costs and make sure I stay neutral and positive and above the market, right? So this is what I do. I simply make sure that firstly, I try to minimize the entities that I hold, right? I know they talk about one property, one entity, but if you want to buy 10 properties or 15 properties, which typically people do, one in every entity is not going to help you. One in every entity, I typically think is going to cost you, add an extra $2,000, $3,000 onto your list. When you have 10 properties and 10 entities, it's going to be $30,000 in just accounting fees, right? So you can minimize that and half that by being clever and saying, I'm maxed out at the land tax level. So let's, for example, say there's $350,000 in Queensland, right? That's where I'm going to max out. That might be one property, might be two properties. Once I max that out, I'm going to set up a new entity. But however, that original entity doesn't stop me from going to ACT, because ACT in Canberra, there is no land tax. So I can fill up this entity with 3, 4 properties, right? That's going to still work. In New South Wales, in Victoria, there's literally nothing in the threshold. So you could be buying other properties. So one entity can actually have properties from ACT, property from Queensland, property from New South Wales, property from Melbourne, right? All of those properties in actually one entity. Now, whether you want to or not, that's a personal decision, but that's one way to minimize your holding costs and one way of ongoing costs as well, right? And of course, you've got to check with the bank just to make sure they can finance all your properties if it's in one entity. But theoretically, we've seen our clients do it, we've helped our clients do it, so we know it can absolutely be done, right? So that's number one. The number two thing that I do is make sure that my tenants pay for my outgoings. So even if I buy a property that the tenant doesn't pay for my outgoings, I have a plan for the next 3 or 5 years where I'm going to gradually offset that outgoing to my tenant or charge a higher rent or find ways to charge a higher rent so that ultimately my tenant pays the outgoings. Because remember, property is not a short-term game. It's not something you do in 1 year and then sell it in the next year. It's a long-term game. 3 or 5 year plan is something that you should definitely have, and therefore you should put that definitely into place, right? So you need to make sure your tenant pays, and the only way the tenant's going to pay all the outgoings, let's face it, is through commercial property and not residential property. So you need to switch to commercial property to make sure there's less burden on you and that you continue to stay afloat and continue to leverage. And then finally, what do I do to stay ahead of the market? I look at opportunities that's opposite the market, so contrarian thinking, so about what other people are not looking at. So perhaps at the moment, no one wants to invest in office space, no one wants to invest in retail space. That might be a really good opportunity for me to get into the market and invest in some of those things that, because swings and roundabouts, when it comes back in 2 or 3 years, I'm going to make that gain. I can leverage off that gain and grow my portfolio exponentially. And that's where I really want to be. So I want to continuously grow, continuously buy. So what I do is I'm constantly looking at the equity that I can pull out of my properties, not just 1 or 2, but maybe across the board 3 or 4 to let me buy another one. We're topping in some cash so that I can stay ahead of the market, but always looking the opposite way to what the market is doing so that I can get ahead of the market. That means that I'm going to get better capital growth, better cash flow than the market, like better returns. So at the same time, I've got less outgoings. That means I can actually grow faster, right? I can actually buy more. And when I do that, I'm actually ahead of the market. I'm looking for opportunities other people are missing. If you want the same thing, you need to join one of our boot camps, upcoming boot camp. We're going to share with you the strategies and workshop it for you. Solid strategy you can start and thrive in 2025. So if you like this video, subscribe, but do comment what you loved about the video. Do comment what else you want to know so I can do my next videos. I really appreciate your help. I love this community. So make sure you do get involved, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye for now.